What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've done multiple deep dives now on the GBU-57, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator carried exclusively by the B-2 Spirit. But this week, a completely different bomber showed up in this war carrying a completely different bunker buster, one I haven't covered on this channel yet. B-1 Lancers are now flying missions out of the UK into Iranian airspace, and they're carrying the GBU-72, a newer, smaller penetrator bomb, alongside what defense analysts are calling mini-MOPs, JDAMs fitted with 2,000-pound bunker buster warheads. And the fact that a non-stealth bomber is doing this openly, in broad daylight, in full view of the media, tells you something huge about how this war's air picture has actually changed. Let's break it all down. I'm going to walk through exactly what's confirmed about this B-1 deployment and the weapons it's carrying, then explain what the GBU-72 actually is and how it's different from the GBU-57 I've covered before, then get into why flying a non-stealth bomber openly into Iranian airspace is itself a significant strategic signal, then connect this directly to the Pickaxe Mountain story I covered in my last video, then cover the broader bomber picture with B-52s now in the mix too, and finish with my take on what this diversification of bunker busting capability actually tells you about where this war's nuclear targeting campaign is heading. According to Axios, the US military used a B-1 long-range bomber this week to strike Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets in Iran, with at least one B-1 taking part in strikes after departing from the United Kingdom, its flight tracked openly by open-source plane tracking websites. CENTCOM did not mention the bomber specifically in its public statement following the operation, and it remains unclear exactly what target it struck or whether the aircraft was chosen specifically because of its unique capabilities. This came during the 12th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, part of what CENTCOM described as forces continuing to strike Iranian military targets, including maritime and coastal facilities. This actually marks the first use of the B-1 since the ceasefire briefly took hold back in early April, according to that same Axios reporting. Footage and reporting from RAF Fairford in Britain shows ground crews loading these B-1s with a specific combination of weapons, AGM-158 JSSM cruise missiles, the kind of standoff weapon that's characterized earlier B-1 operations in this war, alongside GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, fitted with BLU-109 2,000-pound bunker buster warheads. One observer posting from outside the base noted that missile delivery systems were being removed from the B-1s at RAF Fairford to be replaced by JDAM bombs, and specifically pointed out that the Air Force was conducting this loadout in broad daylight, in full view of the media. Now, let's get into the actual weapon that makes this story genuinely new territory for this channel. According to reporting from National Security Journal, the B-1B can drop the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, a bunker buster bomb capable of penetrating the ground up to 150 feet. That's a completely different weapon from the GBU-57 I've spent so much time on in my other videos. The GBU-57 is a 30,000-pound weapon exclusively carried by the B-2, capable of punching through roughly 200 feet of earth or 60 feet of reinforced concrete. The GBU-72 is a smaller, lighter penetrator, part of the broader 5,000-pound bomb class, meaning it can be carried by a much wider range of aircraft, including the B-1, and the B-1 can carry 24 2,000-pound bombs or dozens of cruise missiles in a single mission, giving it enormously more overall weapons capacity per sortie than the B-2's two-bomb GBU-57 loadout. That's an important strategic distinction to understand. The GBU-57 represents maximum penetrating power against the absolute hardest, deepest targets in existence, but it's scarce, expensive, and can only be delivered by a small handful of stealth bombers. The GBU-72 and these mini-MOP JDAMs with BLU-109 warheads represent a different approach entirely. Less penetrating power per weapon, but far greater quantity, far more delivery platform flexibility, and a genuinely different way of solving the same basic problem, defeating hardened and buried targets, just through volume and repetition rather than a single maximally powerful strike. Defense expert Dr. Brent Eastwood, writing for 1945, specifically framed this shift as a transition to what he called mini-MOPs, and noted, this is likely a sign the Air Force is confident the B-1B can conduct precision strikes against hardened nuclear infrastructure using this smaller class of penetrating weapon, rather than relying exclusively on the GBU-57, which, as I've covered in my other videos, exists in extremely limited quantities with a replenishment timeline stretching all the way to 2028. Here's the detail I think actually matters more than the specific weapon being used, and National Security Journal made this point directly. The B-1B is not stealthy. It can be easily tracked by radar over the target area, unlike the B-2, which is specifically designed to minimize radar cross-section. The fact that American forces are willing to fly this non-stealth bomber openly into Iranian airspace, and are doing so with the loadout process happening in broad daylight in full view of media cameras rather than under any kind of operational secrecy, tells you something significant about the current air picture over Iran. That same National Security Journal piece put it plainly, the use of the B-1B confirms that, despite this being relatively early in the broader campaign's overall timeline, air superiority over at least parts of Iran is now firmly established. You don't send a bomber that can be easily tracked and easily targeted by ground-based air defenses into contested airspace unless you're confident those air defenses have already been sufficiently degraded that the aircraft can operate without prohibitive risk. Reporting from World War Wings backs this up with real geographic specificity, noting the B-1s will almost certainly operate over western Iran specifically, where a sustained 2-week focus on air defense suppression has created the most permissive environment for non-stealth bombers, while eastern Iran has seen significantly fewer strikes, and likely remains too risky for B-1 and B-52 operations without additional suppression work first. A Pentagon map covering the first 10 days of this campaign reportedly illustrates exactly that geographic concentration, strikes clustered in the western part of the country, where that permissive air environment has actually been established. I did an entire video breaking down Pickaxe Mountain, the deeply buried Iranian nuclear facility near Natanz that Trump has repeatedly threatened to strike, and this B-1 deployment connects to that story in a genuinely important way. The week reported that Israeli media had informed the public the U.S. would soon deploy heavy bombers for strikes on Iran, presumably targeting fortified nuclear sites, and separately reported that Iran had moved thousands of centrifuges and part of its stockpile of 60% enriched uranium into the Pickaxe Mountain facility specifically. Trump himself, in comments reported by National Security Journal, said the U.S. would target that area, telling reporters from the White House they'd be hitting that area pretty soon and very heavily. Here's where the weapons picture gets genuinely interesting, though. Dr. Eastwood's reporting notes that despite the Trump administration's earlier claims that all Iranian nuclear infrastructure had been eliminated, satellite imagery from civilian spatial intelligence firms has shown Iran adding concrete, soil, and sand over the tops of existing facilities, meaning bunker busters are apparently still needed against targets officials had previously described as already destroyed. That reporting also raises a genuinely important open question: whether the penetrating warheads on these 2,000-pound JDAMs are actually large enough to destroy a facility as deep as Pickaxe Mountain, though it notes they're likely easier and cheaper to produce than full-size GBU-57 MOPs. World War Wings specifically listed the likely target categories for this direct JDAM delivery approach, as including weapons production and development facilities, command and control bunkers, nuclear program infrastructure, and the entrances to Iran's underground missile storage complexes. That last category connecting directly back to the tunnel reopening story I covered in an earlier video, where Iran has been using bulldozers to reopen tunnel entrances faster than strikes could permanently seal them. It's worth understanding this isn't just a B-1 story in isolation. Forbes reported that the deployment of B-1 and B-52 Stratofortress bombers to strike Iran from the UK came after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told reporters the airstrikes on Iran would surge dramatically. That basing arrangement at RAF Fairford only became possible after British officials changed course. Prime Minister Keir Starmer had initially denied the US access to UK bases for this purpose, but relented after Iran carried out a drone strike on a Royal Air Force base in Cyprus. Fairford is described as one of the few European bases capable of hosting bomber aircraft like the B-1, B-2, and B-52 simultaneously, and Forbes noted the Air Force currently maintains 76 B-52H Stratofortress bombers in its total inventory, with 58 in the active force and 18 more in reserve, plus another dozen maintained in long-term storage at the Davis-Monthan Boneyard in Arizona. That combination, B-1s, B-52s, and B-2s, all potentially operating from the same UK basing infrastructure simultaneously, represents a genuinely comprehensive commitment of America's entire strategic bomber fleet to this single conflict. Warrior Mavens separately reported the B-1B has already been used during this broader operation, sometimes called Operation Epic Fury, to strike Iranian missile facilities, military infrastructure, and underground command centers, describing it as particularly effective against hardened targets like underground bunkers and industrial complexes, and noting the aircraft has been substantially upgraded over the years, with new avionics, computing systems, and weapons integration, even being configured in some roles to carry hypersonic weapons. I want to explain a little more about the basing situation here because it's a genuinely interesting diplomatic thread running underneath this entire weapon story. RAF Fairford has functioned for years as one of the primary European bases capable of hosting America's heaviest bomber aircraft, and the fact that Britain initially declined to allow the US to use it for strikes against Iran before reversing that decision after Iran struck an RAF base in Cyprus with a drone tells you this specific basing arrangement was never a simple automatic yes from London. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government had to weigh the diplomatic and domestic political cost of directly hosting offensive operations against Iran, something I touched on in an earlier video when I mentioned several European nations declining to let their bases be used for this exact purpose. Iran's own drone strike on that RAF base in Cyprus appears to have functioned as the specific event that changed Britain's calculus, which is a genuinely important detail. It suggests Iran's own retaliatory actions, rather than deterring further Western involvement, may have actually accelerated it in this specific case, by removing whatever remaining reluctance existed in London about hosting these bomber operations directly. That's worth remembering given how many times throughout this war I've covered Iranian retaliation expanding the geographic footprint of this conflict. Qatar, Oman, Jordan, Syria, and now, at least indirectly, this basing decision in the UK. Every one of those expansions seems to have had the effect of drawing more resources and more capability into the fight against Iran, rather than successfully deterring further escalation the way retaliation is traditionally intended to do. I also want to spend a little more time on what it actually means, from a pure risk management standpoint, to commit non-stealth bombers to this specific fight. Every aircraft that flies into contested or formerly contested airspace carries risk to the aircrew on board, and that risk calculus is fundamentally different for a stealth platform like the B-2, designed from the ground up to minimize the chance of ever being detected and engaged in the first place, versus a legacy platform like the B-1 or B-52, which rely instead on a combination of speed, electronic countermeasures, and critically, the prior suppression of whatever air defenses might otherwise threaten them. That's exactly why the geographic restriction to Western Iran that I mentioned earlier isn't just an operational footnote, it's the entire risk management framework making these B-1 missions viable in the first place. Committing a B-1 crew to a mission over an area where air defenses haven't been sufficiently suppressed would represent a genuinely different, much higher risk decision than flying that same aircraft over territory where weeks of dedicated air defense suppression work has already been completed. The fact that military planners are apparently comfortable making that distinction and confident enough in their own suppression efforts in Western Iran specifically tells you a lot about how methodically this entire air campaign has actually been sequenced. Suppress air defenses first, then expand which aircraft types and which weapons can be used in that increasingly permissive environment, before eventually working toward the harder, less permissive eastern regions, where facilities like Pickaxe Mountain are actually located. I want to give some background on this specific aircraft because I don't think I've covered the B-1 in detail on this channel before, and it has a genuinely interesting service history. The B-1 entered operational service with the Air Force back in 1986, but it made its actual combat debut in 1998 during Operation Desert Fox in Iraq, where it successfully destroyed targets belonging to Saddam Hussein's regime. Known affectionately as the Bone in Air Force circles, a nickname derived from spelling out B-1, it's officially classified by the Air Force as a long-range, multi-role heavy bomber capable of carrying the largest conventional weapons payload in the entire Air Force inventory, up to 75,000 pounds, or roughly 34 metric tons, in a single aircraft. It's built with variable sweep wings and a blended wing body design, powered by 4 afterburning turbofan engines that let it exceed 900 miles per hour, reaching Mach 1. 2 at sea level, genuinely supersonic performance for an aircraft this size. And while it's not classified as a true stealth platform the way the B-2 is, it does incorporate radar-absorbent materials that make it meaningfully harder to detect than older bomber designs like the B-52, giving it a kind of reduced signature profile that sits somewhere between a fully stealth aircraft and a conventional, easily tracked legacy bomber. That's part of why it's returned to this specific conflict. After not being used since the brief ceasefire back in early April, according to Axios, represents such a notable escalation marker. This is a platform with real combat pedigree and genuine payload capacity being reintroduced specifically at a moment when the broader air campaign has evidently matured enough to support it. I want to come back to the actual tactical trade-off between these mini-MOP JDAMs and the full-size GBU-57 because I think it's worth being honest about both the advantages and the real limitations of this smaller weapon class. The clear advantage, as I've laid out, is availability. A B-1 can carry 24 2,000-pound weapons in a single sortie compared to a B-2's 2 GBU-57s, and these smaller penetrators are almost certainly far cheaper and faster to manufacture at scale than the specialized low-rate production GBU-57, which, as I've covered, requires bespoke fuse programming and remains stuck behind a replenishment timeline stretching to 2028. But the limitation is exactly what Dr. Eastwood's reporting flagged. It's genuinely unclear whether these smaller penetrating warheads carry enough raw power to defeat the deepest, most heavily engineered targets in Iran's inventory, the kind of facility Pickaxe Mountain appears to represent. A weapon that can punch through 150 feet of earth, the GBU-72's stated capability, is a serious, meaningful capability against a great many hardened targets, but it's still only half the penetration depth the GBU-57 is credited with achieving. And Pickaxe Mountain has been assessed by multiple analysts I cited in my last video as sitting roughly 330 feet underground, well beyond what even repeated GBU-72 or mini-MOP strikes could plausibly reach in a single engagement. That suggests this diversified bomber and weapon strategy is likely aimed primarily at the broader universe of hardened but somewhat less extreme targets, missile storage tunnels, command bunkers, weapons production facilities, while the single hardest target of all may still ultimately require either a dedicated GBU-57 mission from a B-2 or some combination of approaches nobody has fully detailed publicly yet. Alright, here's where I land on this one. I think the choice to publicize this B-1 deployment so openly, ground crews loading bunker busters in broad daylight at a base in full view of the media, tells you the administration wants this specific message seen and understood clearly by Iran's leadership. This isn't a quiet, covert capability being revealed accidentally through open source tracking. This looks like a deliberate signal. We've established enough air superiority over your airspace that we can now fly our non-stealth heavy bombers openly. And we're doing it specifically to expand our bunker busting capability beyond just the small handful of B-2s and GBU-57s. I also think the mini-MOP concept is a genuinely smart adaptation to the stockpile constraint I've flagged in my other videos on this weapon system. If the GBU-57 really is as scarce and as slow to replenish as the Boeing contract timeline suggests, having a viable, if less powerful, alternative that can be carried by a much larger and more available fleet of aircraft in much greater quantity per mission gives military planners a lot more operational flexibility for targets that don't necessarily require the absolute maximum penetrating power of a full-size MOP. Whether that alternative approach is actually sufficient against something as deliberately over-engineered as Pickaxe Mountain specifically is a genuinely open question. And I think the honest answer, based on everything covered in my last video and reinforced by this reporting, is that nobody fully knows yet, which is probably exactly why we're seeing this kind of incremental capability build up and rhetoric ramp up, rather than an immediate singular strike on that facility. I want to spend a little more time on something I flagged briefly earlier, because I think it deserves its own dedicated section. Militaries don't typically allow journalists and open source trackers to document the loading of specific munitions onto specific aircraft in real time unless there's a deliberate communication strategy behind that visibility. Richard Gaisford's observation that the Air Force positioned these aircraft close to the fence in full view of the media during the loadout process is exactly the kind of detail that suggests this wasn't an operational security failure, it was a choice. Signaling capability. Openly like this serves a real strategic purpose in a conflict like this one. It communicates directly to Iran's leadership, without requiring any formal diplomatic statement, that the American bunker-busting capability arrayed against them now extends well beyond the small, scarce fleet of B-2s and GBU-57s I've covered in my other videos. That's a meaningful message to send at a moment when Iran's own government, as I covered in my video on Pickaxe Mountain, has been actively fortifying and expanding its most hardened remaining facility, likely betting at least in part on the assumption that America's true bunker-busting capacity is limited by the B-2 fleet's small size and the GBU-57's scarce inventory. Publicly showcasing an entirely separate, much more numerous bunker-busting pathway, B-1s and B-52s carrying GBU-72s and mini-MOP JDAMs directly undercuts that assumption. Whether or not this specific weapons combination ultimately proves capable of reaching the deepest chambers of a facility like Pickaxe Mountain itself. So that's the story behind this week's newest addition to America's bunker-busting arsenal in this war, B-1 Lancers flying openly from RAF Fairford in Britain, carrying GBU-72 penetrators and mini-MOP JDAMs fitted with BLU-109 warheads, into an Iranian airspace picture where Western air defenses have apparently been suppressed enough to make non-stealth bomber operations viable. Combined with B-52s joining the fight from the same UK basing infrastructure and everything I've already covered about Pickaxe Mountain and the broader nuclear targeting campaign, this looks like a military that's deliberately diversifying its hardened target strike capability across multiple weapon systems and multiple aircraft types, rather than depending entirely on the scarce GBU-57 and B-2 combination alone. I also want to leave you with a broader thought connecting this to everything else I've covered across this entire series. Every one of these bomber and weapon stories, the B-2 and the GBU-57 at Fordo, the autonomous Corsair vessels striking Iran's naval facilities, and now B-1s and B-52s bringing GBU-72s and mini-MOPs into western Iran, represents the same underlying pattern, the American military systematically working through Iran's layered, dispersed defenses, one capability gap at a time, suppressing air defenses first, then expanding which platforms and weapons can operate safely in that increasingly permissive environment. Whether that methodical, sequential approach eventually produces a credible solution to a target as deliberately over-engineered as Pickaxe Mountain remains the single biggest open question left in this entire war's nuclear dimension. And I don't think this B-1 deployment alone answers that question definitively, but it does tell you the toolkit being built up around that eventual decision keeps growing more diverse and more capable by the week. What do you guys think? Does bringing in this many different bomber types and bunker-busting weapons simultaneously signal a bigger operation is coming, or is this just steady, incremental pressure continuing to build? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. If breaking down the actual hardware and strategy behind these headlines is what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep bringing you this kind of analysis. Check out the video right here next. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.